Hi, welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This is the place where we explore where design, development, and product overlap. Hear from experts about their experiences and the lessons they've learned along the way, and get insights into the latest trends impacting digital product development and design systems from the people who pioneered the industry. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or tell us what you think, send us a message over on LinkedIn. You can find a direct link to our page in the show notes. We'd love to hear from you. Hey everyone, welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Strahl. Today, I'm here with Elyse Holladay. Elyse, welcome to the program. Really excited to have you on.
I'm excited too. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think that we have flirted with the idea of being on each other's podcasts now for like a year. And so I'm glad that we finally got to make it happen. Super excited. We know each other through a variety of community events and just being kind of a part of the design system ecosystem for a while. I'm really excited to talk to you because we have this super interesting kind of hook for today's episode. Are design systems still for people? But before we dive into that, two quick things. First, if you follow Knapsack and you're interested in coming to one of our Patterns events, they are events for design leaders that want to spend time talking with each other, getting to know each other, networking with the community. And these are things that we hold in major cities all across the country. There's one coming to a place near you. If you want to learn more about it, check out knapsack.cloud/patterns. You can apply there, take a look at all of our events, our dates, everything like that. Likewise, we're looking for some more suggestions for topics on the podcast. We're actually going to move to a slightly new format here pretty soon. We're going to be pretty thematic about this podcast and go through sort of like seasons and series in a similar way to Elyse's podcast. As a part of that, we're looking for people to propose ideas or topics. If you have any and you want to let me know about it, feel free to hit me up in the Design System Slack on LinkedIn, or just send a message to DSP at knapsack.cloud. Without further ado, Elyse, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
I have been around the design system space for a really long time. I like to say since before design systems were design systems. And I know I'm not alone in that, but it's been really interesting to see design systems grow. And so I love to think back and think about that history and the way that it's kind of changed over time. So I started doing like CSS architecture back in the day, and then kind of like built proto design systems, then kind of moved into like what we think of as like the current design system era. I was tapped to start the first design system at Indeed.com. So we were building the system that helped the engineering teams move off of Java to React, which was really exciting. I've held basically every design system role. I've worked on the design side. I've worked as an engineer. I've held the unicorn design system PM title. I've done training. I've done public speaking. You may have seen me at Clarity or CSS Conf. And in the last couple of years, I took a break from tech and I left and started my own business. I did a personal style coaching program, so got some entrepreneurship experience. And I am back now in design systems at a company called Color Health. I'm our staff design engineer, so I manage our design system as a solo design system team, both on the design and engineering side, supporting both our designers and engineers. And recently started, as Chris mentioned, a design system podcast called On Theme. You can check out the first season. We just wrapped in May. I'll be back with more very soon.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's definitely worth a listen. I've gotten through about a third of the episodes myself. I love the content. It's great stuff. Thinking about your career arc, you've kind of gone through this in a couple of different iterations, from big to small to entrepreneurship. What's made you kind of like land in the place that you've landed now? I mean, you're obviously like enthusiastic and excited about the work that you're doing, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. But I think that you've kind of followed innovation is maybe a safe way to put it. What's got you excited about what you're doing right now? And kind of tell me a little bit more about how that career path got shaped.
I love the idea of following innovation. I don't know if that's a phrase that I would have said particularly, but I think it kind of is true. I don't really consider myself fully a designer or fully an engineer. I like making things happen. I'm an activator. I like making things go. I like influencing people. So this design system space to me has always been about how can we do this better? How can we make this thing happen? Like, why can't we have that nice thing? Why can't it be like that? I really got my start in the tech space in general. And my first official, like real job out of college was at Bazaar Voice, which you may know for popularizing ratings and reviews. So if you are on a site that has customer ratings and reviews, that was Bazaar Voice back in the day. And I was like writing CSS. It was like the beginning of like CSS architecture. And that really stemmed from wait, like, why are we taking all of the CSS that our Java engineers wrote and having to like revise all of it before we can even start styling any given implementation for a customer? And that was like the beginning of design systems. Then it turned into, how do we make sticker sheets? How do we make components? Now it's, how do we make abstractions? How do we make tools? But I've always seen this work as enabling and influencing other people to have better tools and have better processes so that they can make things. And I think that rather than a focus on like the design itself or the components itself or the code itself, and I think that's why I love this space. And I think that's why I've followed, as you say, followed innovation, or like I'm kind of excited about AI, which we're definitely going to talk about, because it's changing the way that we work and changing our behaviors around work. And that's what I think design systems has always been about.
Yeah. So I love this connection between the idea of how we're going to be leveraging AI and systems in concert with the evolution of systems thinking generally. You talked about CSS and a lot of those like early formative things, right? I mean, a lot of the design systems group in the community and the whole idea of design tokens came out of like a SAS group in SF. And so all of these kind of like humble origins of the idea of systems and how we work better are now leading us to this future where we're looking at AI, we're looking at the systems concepts that we've built, and we're saying, how do these things fit together? And I agree with you. It's a lot about reshaping. And so when we think about that, and we think about that concept of reshaping and innovation tying themselves together, the way I've heard you frame this before is about this is changing our priorities. When we talk about those priorities and how that's shifting, explain to me what you mean by that. Because it's not like this stuff is going away. It's just morphing a little bit.
Yeah, here's what I think is a straightforward example. In the early days of design systems, remember 2010 to 14, we didn't have a way to share component code. And I throw back to this on my podcast, and I've been talking about this a lot because it's so different than how we think about building products now, that if you weren't there and you're not old and you don't remember, then it's hard to kind of wrap your head around that was the case. And so a lot of the things that influenced design systems today started by, how do we solve this problem of literally just sharing a component? And so much of what we did was make components. Like first we made tools so that you could even share component code across instances. Then we were like, oh, how do we abstract this? Then there was React. Now we have props. Now we have something like Sketch. Now we have Figma. Like it was all about layering on these abstractions to share a chunk of something.
Yeah, the collaboration was the problem, right? It's not like it was about necessarily ever writing a button. That's not necessarily the hard part. It's like getting everybody to use it.
No, but we got really focused on writing a button because the original problem was we can't have a single button and actually share it. And so we built all these tools and abstractions so that we could have a single button component and share it. And then I think we became overly focused on that as the deliverable because it is what we had been trying to deliver for so long. And it was the mechanism that we had to do that collaboration. But I actually see the change that we're going through right now as a full circle moment where we're coming back to some of the original problems that spawned design systems by saying, wait, how do we collaborate? How do we build UIs? And we have lots of tools to do that with now that we didn't have before. But at the end of the day, we're doing the same thing that we were doing in 2008 or 2010, which is building UIs, building web apps. And the tools have just evolved in such a way that some of our initial problems aren't problems anymore. So we're actually having to go back to some of the really hard stuff, which is people and organizations and behavior change. And it's not the component that's the hard part now.
Yeah, so when you think about that idea of coming back to those original problems, I think there's also a context thing that I want to frame this in, and that the world of AI and the modern way of building products is putting a pretty tremendous amount of pressure on teams. And there is this drumbeat of do more with less. The surface area of our applications is maybe 2 orders of magnitude larger than it was in 2008, 2010, 2014. And yet teams aren't necessarily bigger. I think companies have a better understanding of how investment works in terms of product, but it's one of those situations where a smaller team has to go faster than ever before. I kind of want to talk about that, especially relative to your context, when it comes to this idea is like, hey, you're a solo person that is managing this for not the world's biggest company, but certainly a sizable organization. How do you think about that context and that problem space overlaid with these problems that we have to solve?
I love being a solo design system person. I know that it's not for everybody, but as somebody who is cross-functional and kind of a generalist, I feel like I have a lot of autonomy. I think small teams, whether it's one or three or whatever, you have some autonomy and some flexibility that a big team just doesn't have. And in some ways, I think that actually makes it easier to quote unquote do more with less. And I feel like big teams, especially big platform or design system teams, you can get really bogged down in team ceremonies, team process, team politics, team governance, decision making by consensus. And some of that stuff is good. I'm not anti-process, but I think the bigger a team gets, you spend a lot of time doing your own inter-team process. You should be protective of your time, and I'm very protective of my time, but you get very like, oh, we have to have a governance process for anybody who even wants to speak to us to come to like a specific office hours time slot and go through this 85-step checklist. And all of that is done in the service of like protecting your time and your roadmap. And I get that and I respect that. But it often, I think, takes away from some of the things that you can just do and the decisions that you can just make. And when you are solo or small, you have to say no a lot. You know that it can never be done. I think when you automatically assume you can get more resources, you're like, oh, we could just do more if we had more resources. I know that I'm not getting any more resources. So I'm like, all right, how do I own this? How do I find a way to say yes? How do I find a way to make this work? And so I think you have to bring that energy. Our company leadership is not going, do more with less, just use AI. And I know that there are CEOs out there who are doing that. I think we're very much in the novelty stage of like, oh, we can just not have front-end engineers and have the AIs do it. And I know that some people are under that pressure, but I don't think about it as trying to do even more. I'm thinking about it as, how do I do the thing that is most relevant? Like, what's the next right thing, the most relevant thing, the thing that is actually going to impact my team, my engineers, my designers? I'm never going to get to everything. So how do I do the most valuable thing? And you just have to be really ruthless about making those decisions because you're never going to get to all of it. We had a design system team of, 8 or 10 or 20 companies out there have these big design system teams. All of them are going, we never get to everything. There's always more to do. Like, I think we just have to recognize that that's just going to be the case.
Yeah, I also think there was this period of time that may be behind us, maybe not, where people put a lot of investment into the polish of the system, making it like a portfolio piece almost, right? And I think that as design systems teams trend towards looking more like yours versus a 30-person organization all working on building out a system, I think that idea of like, this is a portfolio piece is starting to slide. There's a reason why we built them that way, right? It was this idea that like, we need to welcome people, we need to draw them in, we need to have all this empathy that we build towards the system. And like, yes, it's a tool, but it's also this like basically an art piece. And we can all argue about like whether that was navel gazing or what, right? But the ultimate thing is like a lot of people built that stuff, right? And a lot of big companies invested millions of dollars in what were ostensibly like showpieces where they had like design.myfortune500.com that became this way of drawing people into the organization. As that is shifting and we're seeing much more of a trend towards like the functional bits, is who we're building these things for changing?
I think a lot of those published, polished, fancy, shiny doc sites were recognizing now that they were marketing plays. The whole like zero interest rate period over the last, 10 years kind of ending right after COVID was, we had a lot of money. We could spend that money. We were showing off how cool we were and, trying to like hire people and like be out there. And I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think the recognition is that those were marketing artifacts and may or may not have been the most useful to your engineers and designers. And I'm not saying they're not useful, but they may not be the most useful thing. And I love the way that Dan Mall talks about this. He has a saying where he's talking about this, that your documentation should be a journal of how things get used and an ongoing description of the ways that your components and your designs and your design guidelines are actually being in use, instead of a button is a clickable element that a user can click to do an action. And like that stuff, I think the other big change is we're recognizing that that's not actually useful. Like if you're an engineer or a designer on a product team and you don't know what a button is, the documentation is not going to save you. Like you have a bigger problem. And so now we're recognizing that the kind of documentation we need, the kind of things that we need to provide to our designers and our engineers is actually different. It's not an essay on like what every component is, but it's actually more of guidelines on how things can be used. And it's more about patterns. I've actually had a bunch of requests over the last month or two on, hey, can we get a refresher course on like how we build layouts with like Flexbox? That's the kind of stuff that my engineers are asking for. And that's like related to the design system, but you're not going to find that in a specific component documentation.
It actually harkens back to this implementation of Knapsack we actually just did, where one of the things that was really interesting about the way this team used Knapsack is they actually had tabs where they would put Jira tickets that were the origination of those components. And then they would put like lots of code examples in another tab where they could actually have like implementations, and then links to a portion of the live website where you could see that in action. And all of that ability to kind of like create a thoughtful understanding of why it was built the way it was built and how you actually go about implementing, not just like the idea of like what it is, that was super powerful. It's a very pragmatic approach to getting people to understand what it's for beyond just saying like a tile is a surface and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. I think the other thing that's changed is engineering understanding of these abstractions has changed. We touched on this a few minutes ago about, we didn't have components, but a lot of times teams were building these design systems, they were building components from scratch, and they were building documentation from scratch because it was not familiar that you had a card or an accordion, or like, how do you compose these things? Or like, how does this work as like a pre-built thing that I can use? But now we have Material UI, we have ShadCN, we have Chakra, we have Ant Design, we have every design system student or engineering student makes a quote unquote component library or a design system as like their portfolio project. Like these are common abstractions now in software development and software design. Everybody knows now. So there's a lot of things that we don't necessarily have to say. And I think you asking like, why do we don't need these doc sites anymore? It's like, yeah, because we need to actually document some different stuff. That stuff was useful. We've changed. Our expectations have changed. Our knowledge as an industry has changed. And now we need to talk about different things.
I mean, I think that's a great segue into the idea of like what's on the horizon, right? I mean, now if we're talking about AI and most of our docs are being read by AI, are we actually making design systems for people anymore? Or is this really just about like the context for robots? Talk about a significantly different need, right? If I don't need to understand the underlying concepts of how my product is built, I just need to understand how that output functions and make sure that that output functions in a way that's expected for a user. Do I even really care about that deep understanding of all the use cases for my tile or my button?
I think you're absolutely right. We are going to be using the artifacts of design systems in a much more abstracted way. I don't think that most engineers who use a design system spend a lot of time reading the guts of the component code. Even before AI, you're like, what's there? How do I use it? Maybe you skim the props. You're just sort of being like, does this do what I want it to do? And maybe you read some of the docs, but a lot of times I think what was happening is engineers were looking at the props that were available in the component and just being like, well, I don't see a prop that's like named the thing that I want. Like, it doesn't do what I want. Even if it did, if it didn't do it in some kind of clear way. And I think that that is now an accelerated abstraction, right? But on the positive side, you don't actually have to understand the guts of the component really deeply because you have this LLM augmented way of asking, does it do the thing that I want? Can I put, a picture and, connect that to the MCP and it can read the guts of the component code and tell you whether or not that's possible. And so I think humans are still going to be responsible for the design guidelines, the design thinking, the UX, the output. We've been having a lot of conversations internally about how, as an engineer, even if you use an LLM, you are still personally responsible for the output of that code that you are shipping into the code base. I think it's definitely changing the way that engineers are going to be using these components. And I think, honestly, in kind of a better way. I think we might actually see less of, well, I didn't know it could do that, so I just went off the rails and did my own thing, or edited the component or whatever, because I think you actually have a way to say, hey, can it do this? And have that be interpreted correctly.
I think it gets back to the idea of what problem are we trying to solve? I don't think design systems have ever necessarily been good at saying these are the boundaries of what you can and can't do, but it's been a good job of being able to say this is how you should think about something or how you should use something. My co-founder Evan's favorite example is a design system is going to give you a grid and it's going to give you a hero, but it's never going to tell you to not make a grid of heroes. And so the idea of how AI gets used to interpret these models and these ideas, being able to be much more focused on the problem you're trying to solve instead of how it's constructed is, I think, really interesting. And it gets to your very first point about layers of abstraction. For so long, we've been building abstractions on top of code to try to understand, collaborate, and convey the meaning of what we're trying to build. We're really empowering a lot of people with AI to say okay, I can actually talk about what I want or what my intention is using more or less plain English, and then have a result that is closer to me and closer ostensibly to the problem than it's ever been before. And so that, I think, is my provocative statement around, other than are we making design systems for robots? The real thing that I want to kind of hone in on is, are we shedding abstractions? Because that's kind of what it feels like to me.
I see it as another abstraction layer on top. It's the third or fourth layer on the layer cake. I don't think it's getting rid of any abstractions. Maybe that will change over time. But right now, I think that design systems are actually really critical for allowing LLMs to do what you just described, which is have somebody, an engineer, a designer, a PM, go in and in their native language, without having to learn how to code, say, hey, I want to build something that looks like this and does this. And, you click on this thing and it expands and whatever. You get much higher quality output when you have components underneath that. There may be a case where at some point we don't even need that and it can just sort of make it up, but then you have a maintenance problem. I think those abstractions are still all there.
This gets into the idea of how does cursor work versus how does an actual developer using components work, right? And I'm a big fan of looking at AI in terms of how do we automate or streamline human-based workflows that are already prevalent, that are giving us good results, that have good outputs, right?
That's certainly where we are right now. And that may change at some point, but that's where we are right now.
So if you're having something that is built by basically just prompting a agentic code gen tool and it's writing React for you, versus something that is leveraging a design system to say okay, what I'm actually passing is I already have the React, I'm just passing props to it or whatever it is that is the thing that you're doing to actually make it the way you want. The better output, in my opinion, is still not the wholly new generated thing. It's the ability to use the stuff that's been blessed, that's been understood because of accessibility and performance and all these other concerns that go into how we make that thing. The problem to me with a lot of the agentic tools seems that there's no workflow attached to that. There's nothing that says this is how we go about the process of taking this thing that the LLM wrote and actually making it performant and accessible and all the other things that you need to think about when you write a big piece of software.
Well, that's the stuff that I think a design system can very impactfully help abstract away, and not just in components. One of the things that I've been doing a lot of experimentation with is, how do I provide design guidelines into, in our case, it's Cursor. And when I say design guidelines, I'm talking about stuff like, here's how you build when you use Flexbox or CSS Grid. Here's things that you should think about around combining components. Here, be sure to look for components like this, even if the engineer doesn't say anything. And I actually think that there's a lot that we can do to continue to grow that, right? You're talking about accessibility. You're talking about performance. Here's a little spicy opinion for you, though. I actually Like, how much time do we spend trying to get our engineers to be like, don't forget to think about this and don't forget to think about that. And don't forget to look at all of the things that are available to you and be sure to use this best practice pattern. I can literally write a doc that tells the LLM that it has to do it, and it will pretty much do it. And yes, it's not deterministic. Yes, you don't always get exactly what you want. And yes, you have to be good at prompting. But the kind of guardrails that I've been able to put around UI in our system have been super impactful. I can make it so easy for my engineers to not have to think about all of these little annoying, arbitrary consistency ways of like using SX or using the theme or doing this or doing that. And, some of it's linting, but the computer helps them. The computer is right there by their side as they go through and do that. And I think we're actually going to see that expand to more to what you were talking about around much larger patterns. I have a special hate for the Material UI grid component, which is just like the worst. It's called grid. It uses Flexbox. It's a conceptual grid that doesn't make any sense with how CSS works. It's so bad that they're deprecating it. But things like that, like we built these code abstractions around design concepts that actually made writing the code harder. And I think those things actually are going to get kind of ejected out of the system because the LLM can just write CSS grid, or it can think about, we have these design patterns around how we show states or how we show alerts and how we make sure that those alerts are accessible. We have a icon actions that appear on hover pattern in part of our product. And like, that's a pattern that could actually be used in lots of different places. It doesn't necessarily have to use the same component. And right now it is the same component. If you think about design guidelines as just like an algorithm, if you can codify what these design decisions are into a document that the machine can comprehend, like I do think that there are some abstractions we're going to remove.
Hey everyone, I'd like to take a quick break and tell you about Knapsack's Leadership Summits. Every month, we host an exclusive in-person event in different cities all around the country, bringing together design, engineering, and product leaders. These summits are all about sharing our learning, with tailored discussions to address the challenges you're facing. The best part, it's totally free. Head over to knapsack.cloud/events to find an upcoming summit near you and apply to join us. We'd love to see you there. So isn't that then the design system, that document you just described? It probably looks a little unlike the design systems that exist today, where there's a bunch of like component examples and patterns and stuff like that. But like, to me, that's the specs. That's the props and the slots. There's probably some docs that describe how those specs work and like enumerate variations and types and stuff like that. But that's the kind of stuff that the machine cares about. And so the way you described it makes it sound like fundamental infrastructure. It's the way these LLMs are going to work. And I'm curious about how you think about human roles here, because I think you and I think about this like very alike in this regard, where the days of this 30-person team that is building this giant product, we used to call design systems a product all the time. I think that there's still a lot of people that think about it that way. When you ultimately look at the end state of that, that looks a lot more like infrastructure in my mind. And in that infrastructure, you have a few people that are on a design systems teams that are about maintaining that infrastructure. And then you have a whole bunch of other people that value that infrastructure for how they can use it to create. And so the maximal usage of design systems with AI in the future to me is like, there's a handful of people that are out there building the context, the control points, the data that is the thing that feeds that machine. And then everybody else becomes a consumer of that through whatever agentic system you're using to make something.
Yes, and I think there's some really cool ways that this can enable everybody to, I'm going to use the word, just imagine me doing air quotes right now, contribution. I think contribution in the way that we talked about it for the last 10 years has been dead. I think that it never really quite materialized in the way that we kind of wrote think pieces on.
Oh yeah, we were all going to have like these mini open source communities that existed inside of our organizations.
No.
And all that stuff.
No.
Yeah.
So like the example I was just giving about these hover actions, that's not actually in our design system. That's in a product, but it is a design UX pattern that we have created for this product and can be used in lots of parts of that product. And if you can think about a designer who doesn't have to know how to code to be able to say, hey, this component or this pattern of like actions on hover, icons appearing on hover to do actions, I can actually now go in and like the component is the prompt of like this pattern exists and we want to use it in cases like this but not cases like that, and these are the available icon slots that it can have. If you don't actually have to go in and write the React component, you maybe now have a really different way of contributing those design patterns and design guidelines back to the system. And I think maybe one of the things that you're getting at when you say, oh, is that the system? Is the system going to be kind of abstracted away? Is I think that line between design system components and like patterns or quote unquote components inside the product is going to get a lot blurrier because they're all just building on top of each other. And then it's not so much about like owning a specific chunk of code as it is owning the definition, the spec of the options that are available, when you use it, how you use it, why you might use it, and then relying on that as the interface for how it gets used. But obviously, that's making a lot of assumptions about everybody on a team, is using the LLM tools. And like right now, it's still very fragmented. And I think that's not necessarily the case. I would be sad, I think, to see a world where we have no ability to define or own those code chunks or patterns. Maybe I'll live to eat those words, but I think that not understanding the output of the thing that we're making is a real failure state of using LLMs safely and successfully.
When you think about like the amount of permutations or the amount of creativity that you can get out of a single design system, I tend to think about it like a deck of cards, right? If every card is a component and there are 52 of them, how many 5-card hands can I make? And the answer is around 2.5 million. That's not even assuming that there's variations, right? And so, if you're in this situation where you have potentially thousands or tens of thousands of variations of things, there maybe is a future where we don't really think about the craft as much. There's a really interesting quote from Scott Belsky, who used to be CPO of Adobe, where he talks about the idea of like indexing on taste, not skill, because the idea is that LLMs are very quickly eroding the value of skill and replacing it with the value in taste. And so what is the best, of those 2.5 million different combinations?
And when do you use them and why would you use them and when do you make those trade-offs? I think this is a place that we are going to need to, as design system practitioners, own and support. I completely agree about taste because so many times, like how many times have you heard, well, we can't do that because it's hard in the code or we can't put it in the system or like there's not time. Like those are the kinds of problems that are actually becoming easier and easier and easier. The machines are so fast at very well prompted, well-defined refactors, even when they are big and complex, that it's a lot easier to say like, oh yeah, we could change that pattern everywhere. Frankly, we could change that pattern everywhere, even if it's not using a component. We are not that far away from being able to say, hey, go find me every place where we have this thing that should be using the component, but it's not, and the pattern is kind of wrong, and like refactor them. I've already been working on refactors that are kind of approaching that level of complexity.
We are so close to the idea of like, I have a legacy product that I need to update into a like component derived code base, and just like doing that with a couple of button clicks.
I think we are very close to that, but where the LLM still can't quite do it is in all of the requirements and context that are needed. And I don't mean context in the kind of context you feed to the LLM. I mean, why did we make this business decision? Why is this feature still in there? Is that even a feature that we use? If you are going to feed an LLM a crappy, poorly built legacy product, it will do a very good job of faithfully recreating all of your stupid ass decisions and like poor architecture, and completely doing a brand new, version requires very, very good understanding of the requirements and the needs and how things fit together, as well as all of the like code implications and the design implications. And so the tools are getting better at that. We're going to see it happen. But I think that taste and understanding the, I'm going to say business logic and business decisions as a very, very big bucket of why might we do something? What matters to us? Where should we focus? What value does it provide to our team or our users or the business or whatever? And being able to guide the LLM to do those things still matters so, so, so much. I think that especially at the exec level, there's a little bit of magical thinking about you just plug it into the LLM and like it'll just spit out like all of this amazing code and like, wow, look at all this output, great, yay, artifacts.
Hey, I made an iPhone app. I put it in an LLM and a website.
yeah, exactly. There's a lot of stuff that ICs rightfully are like, excuse me.
Right,
like,
there's a lot of cringe.
And it's not just because we're attached to craft as an identity, although I think many people are. It's that we recognize that there's lots of complexities that are not being accurately represented in the idea that just making lots of code output is high value.
It's also interesting. I tend to think about this also in the context of like, is this just another abstraction, right? So I know I'm contradicting my earlier statement somewhat intentionally. And that like, I don't think about how my operating system works on my computer. I don't think about how the pixels show up on the screen. I just know that like when I pull up a Zoom call, like that app should work in the context of my screen and in the context of my operating system. And so when I think about that from like a creating product and LLM point of view, one of the things that I tend to think about there is like, is this just another form of an operating system? An operating system is an abstraction from hardware. An LLM is an abstraction from a lot of the software decisions that we've made. And we have similar things that we can draw from, right? I think that few of them function like AI, where they have that like non-deterministic bent or lean to them. They have a much more like creative concept behind them. But I think that what we're talking about isn't necessarily unprecedented in the way that we think about building. There's very few people, even though I do know one, that think about like how the web should look in 10-bit color.
Like, are you going in on your Game Boy? Like, we're not doing that.
Yeah, like all the things that people think about when it comes to like how you actually derive the thing that shows up in the glowing rectangle, be that on a cell phone or be that on a desktop or whatever. There's already a lot that comes before that. It's all about
the CSS spec, the browser.
Exactly, right?
Like, we don't think about that stuff.
But somebody does. And somebody at that lower level is always building that thing. Are we just defining a new lower level?
I mean, yeah, I think so. And I think that there's going to be, as with all of those changes, an adjustment in what we think about as, you know, tech savviness or in the value of those roles. I have a lot of thoughts about the valuation or devaluation of particular skills, CSS. But, you know, every time we go through a change like this, like we're not programming in assembly anymore. Now we're using the browser. Now we're using JavaScript. Now, like, I love every time I read a headline that's like, we really need some COBOL engineers because we have this giant, like, you know, financial or like government code base that's all in like COBOL and like nobody knows how to do this anymore. Those skills are not going to fully go away. And there's still going to be people involved in like all of these steps. And I think it's going to be a very long time before we see the fear/hype version of this AI future in which humans are, you know, it's like WALL-E and humans are just like completely out of the picture. I think we got a ways to go before we have to really worry about that.
I do want my AI to be a much cuter robot than it is right now. That's for sure. I love this idea about like, hey, look, what we're doing is we're changing the interaction model. We're changing the interface. We're changing the way that we work with the medium that we're destined for, which is ultimately like, for most of us, HTML and CSS in a web browser or Swift code in an iPhone or an iOS. There's all these different things that represent the tools of the trade. And I think that those tools are morphing. And kind of what I said before, like maybe we're defining a new baseline about what people have to really be experts in. But you've got this wonderful point of like, this isn't about discarding what became before. We have this idea of all these things, all these techniques, all these processes, all these assets that we built up. Those are still useful. And especially like the ways of working and the ways that we like connect as people, that I just would like to touch on kind of as a closing thought, right? When it comes to working with all these LLMs, one of the things that we talked about very early on in this episode was the idea that like when we started first talking about componentry and design tools and all these things that we were building, it was all about fundamentally the ability to collaborate with other people and to be able to share those concepts and those ideas. I think that there is a world where a lot of these LLM and AI tools are enabling that. And maybe the AI is another person sitting around that table. I don't know. But it's one of those situations where I think it is still about like, how do we think about collaborating?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think somewhere between thing that frustrates me / advice I would love to give to design system practitioners right now is to be thinking a little bit more creatively about how we can actually use these tools. There has been a lot of freaking out that it is going to replace people's jobs.
And it is. But here's the thing. It doesn't mean that it doesn't create new jobs or new opportunities.
But I think a lot of that is also hype and CEOs, no offense, I know you're a CEO, but like CEOs' ways of being like, we overhired and we need to just like cut some people and we're going to pretend it's all about AI, even though it's like kind of actually secretly not.
I need to do some profit taking. So I'm going to blame this new tech on how I can fire people. Yeah.
Exactly. But I think we have focused very much on, oh my God, it can write a component. Oh my God, it can write docs. Oh, it can generate some code. And you mentioned earlier thinking about craft as identity. If you're thinking about yourself and your only value to your organization as I sit here and I type semicolons into the glowing screen and I move pixels around and I make an input and a button, like I think that is just such a small way of thinking about what you can actually do. I love the content that folks like John Voss put out where they're talking about, how do we actually be more ethical when we're designing? How do we think about the impacts of the things that we're making? Color's a health tech company. We're in the cancer space. We're thinking about like, how do we engage with the healthcare system in the United States? And components feel pretty far away from that sometimes, but we are really, really focused on that as like the identity of our work. And Gina has been saying this since the dawn of design systems, but like, design systems is people, design systems is behavioral change. I really think about design systems work as organizational behavior change. And components don't do that. Components have never done that. We were making components so that we could use them in a way that changed the organization and people's behavior and the way that they worked. And so when you're thinking about how you're using AI around your design system and you're going, well, it can just hallucinate design system guidelines, like a human can do that better, or it can just like write some component code and it could be wrong. I feel like that's just such a small way of thinking about what it is that you can do with these tools and what it is that you can bring to your company and to your organization and to your team. There are all kinds of other ways that these tools can let roles be in the code and the design in a way that they never have before. Allow contribution, allow questioning, allow understanding, allow knowledge sharing that are not actually damaging to your role. And I think we get really focused on the things that are very scary. And there's a lot more that can be done, I think, if we're a little bit creative. And obviously, it is going to replace some roles. Things are going to change. I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't be worried or afraid that there's not like things to be freaked out about. But I think that we can maybe be a little more optimistic than I think sometimes the discourse in design systems currently has been around this stuff.
The whole idea of, does anybody write in jQuery anymore? Yeah, I mean, sure, there's some people that do. But the reality is like that job doesn't really exist anymore. Everybody's role undergoes an evolution. This happens to be a big one. But I love your sort of very pragmatic, but also very optimistic take on it. I think that's awesome.
Thanks. I started this episode saying like I've seen all of this change since the beginning of design systems. And one of the things that I've talked about many, many times on the podcast, I give a talk at Clarity about this, is like our tools change, our needs and our capabilities change and evolve. We built all these tools to solve our own problems and to make new abstractions. And that's where React came from. If you have been working in this space since before React, you remember how big of a shift that was. AI maybe is a little bit bigger than React, but we're still seeing the ways that we do the same thing, building technology, building software, trying to collaborate, trying to share context between design and engineering. We're just doing it in different ways. And I don't know. I don't want to be afraid of that. I don't want to be afraid every day that I go to work and convinced that I'm not valuable, my work is not valuable. And I think that we can always find ways to do good and to be valuable. And I hope that we can.
Maybe we can all find ways to follow the curve of innovation.
Well, just to not be afraid. Like not to get like all emotional and serious, but it is hard to be creative when you are afraid. And the world is scary and there's a lot to be stressed out about. But when we can bring some optimism to the table, I think it really opens up a lot of different possibilities.
Awesome. Well, Elyse, this has been so much fun. Thank you for being on, for finally making this happen.
We finally made it work.
It's been a great conversation, and I really appreciate your insights. Thanks so much for taking the time. We'll put in the show notes where folks can find your podcast, but also if you just want to shout it out, love a little cross promo.
Yes, totally. Would love to have you come and listen. The podcast is called On Theme, Design Systems in Depth. You can find it at designsystemsontheme.com or my LinkedIn. We're going to get into season 2, hopefully in, next couple of months. So if you want to be a guest, if you have spicy opinions about design systems, send me a message and come be on the show. And then Chris, maybe we'll have you come on the show too.
I love that. Well, thank you again. This has been the Design System Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Strahl. Have a great day, everyone. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. If you have any questions, topic suggestions, or want to share feedback, go ahead and reach out to us on LinkedIn. Our profile is linked in the show notes. As always, the podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day, everyone.